Dear friends, through the present lecture, I will discuss the Romantic period, Victorian period, and the modern age of the English poetry. So, this is the division of the present lecture. The official announcement of the beginning of the Romantic period is conventionally given to the event, which that event is very important one, with the publication of lyrical ballad, anthology of the poem written by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798. The 18th century poetry followed the classical rules of the English literature, as I mentioned in the last part, in terms of diction, meter, themes, and stanza forms. The 18th century poetry depicted the subject mostly centered around the urban aristocracy or the society which is centered around London. The poems in lyrical ballad deliberately brought a shift in the content and form of the poetry. Actually, these are two great poets, so they shifted the poetry to the country life. So they intentionally they wanted to do an experiment, but that experiment becomes their belief after the criticism of the publication of the lyrical ballad in 1798. That's why, in order to defend their view, William Wordsworth wrote a preface to the lyrical ballad, and that is the dogma, which is known for the Romantic period. And from that point of time begins the Romantic period. The poems in the lyrical ballad are natural poetry, so they are revolving around the country people, their way of life, their simple simplicity. This shift is clearly reflected in the preface that is I mentioned, 18, 1800. The audience had different taste for the reading poetry in terms of subject matter, form, and diction. Wordsworth attempted a justification for the kind of poetry he has composed along with his friend. He defined the poetry as a man speaking to men. He reasoned that the way of life of the rustics are pure, simple, and natural one, and that can be used for this for the theme of the poems. England. Uh, he selected the people and places from the rustic, rural England and gave expression to them in the language that they really used, of course, with a certain refinement. So that is suggested in the in that preface to the lyrical ballad. Thus, the subject matter of the poetry was deliberately chosen from the low, rustic life, country life, and the common element from the nature. So, return to the nature, that was the call of the Romantic age. See, they don't want to restrict themselves with the rules which are laid by the neoclassical poets. As I mentioned, the neoclassical poetry is revolving around the aristocratic families. There is no place for the country peoples. So that's why this is the shift from that tradition. Even the titles of the Wordsworth's poems are indicative one, and those they shows this a shift, like daffodil, the solitary reaper, the leech gatherer, and so on. Another important subject of Romantic poetry is the treatment of the beauteous form of nature. Obviously, it is known as the pictorial quality of these great poets. Here I am giving you some of the titles of the poems written by William Wordsworth, Tinter Abbey, Coleridge, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, John Keats to the Nightingale, Shelley's to a Skylark, or to the West Wind. This cult of nature worship in the Romantic poetry is due to the influence of the Rousseau's call of return to nature. That was the call by the Rousseau. And French Revolution really influenced the mindset of the present or contemporary period of the England. The most celebrated poet of nature after Wordsworth is John Keats. John Keats is specifically known as the poet of the odes. His odes are very famous, like Ode to Nightingale in 1819, Ode to Psyche in 1819, Ode on Grecian Urn in 1820, Ode on Melancholy in 1820, Ode to Autumn in 1820, and Ode on Indolence in 1848. As I mentioned, the pictorial quality is very significant one for these romantic periods. Personally, I feel a very affinity liking of the John Keats ode. As we have seen, ode is in the form of an address. This poem is nothing but it's an address to animate or inanimate. The poems are very serious one, elevated in style. So, as I mentioned, that it is in the form of an address, so that's why obviously there is an personification of some of the inanimate things. For example, Ode on Grecian Urn, the beginning line suggests that it is an address to the inanimate thing, that is earthen pot, that is urn, Grecian urn. Thou still unpunished bride of poetess. That was the beginning line of the poem. Keats had a very short-lived life of just 26 years, but in this shorter period, his sensuousness treatment to the object of the nature earned him eternal fame. Romantic poetry was not just committed to the beauteous forms of nature alone. Romantic poets were fully aware of the social, political, and religious transformation of their age. Wordsworth and Coleridge initially welcomed and supported the French Revolution. Later on, they got disappointed due to the reign of the terror and the rise of the Napoleon in France. The second generation Romantic poets, notably Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron, were rebellious in their poetry and life. Especially, Shelley is a stern critic of the contemporary social and political evils. Shelley's poems overtly rebuke the monarchy and aristocracy of the contemporary England. His poems, England in 1890 and The Mask of Anarchy, depicts the adverse effect of the monarchy on the life of the English people. The poems of the Wordsworth also brings out the plight of the common people in England. Another important poet who actually belongs to the pre-Romantic period but continued to write in the Romantic period is William Blake. William Blake's two anthologies are very famous one, the Song of Innocence and Song of Experience. Blake poetry brings out the ills of the social, political and religious life of the contemporary England. In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell in 1793, Blake criticizes the assumptions in the Holy Bible. In his poem London 1793, Blake describes the anger of soldiers returning from the war about the authorities. Blake's famous poem, The Chimney Sweeper, in 1789 brings out one of the horrors of industrialization, child labor. Thus, the romantic poetry not only deals with the things of beauty but also depicts the social, political, and religious issues of the contemporary. The next development of the English poetry is Victorian period. The period after Romanticism is known as the Victorian period, and that is spanned between 1837 to 1900. Because Queen Victoria ascended the throne of the England in 1837, so that is the mark. That is the beginning of the Victorian period. The Victorian period is divided into two phases. The early Victorian, that is the span between the 1837 to 1850, and the latter two phases, the latter Victorian period is from 1850 to 1900. The two major poets of the early Victorian English poetry are the Lord Alfred Tennyson and the Robert Browning. Tennyson is known for his beautiful lyrics like Lotus Eater in 1832, Ulysses in 1833, and In Memoriam in 1850. Robert Browning is known for a special form of poetry, dramatic monologue. That is the significant contribution by the Robert Browning. Dramatic monologue is a short poem in which a speaker addresses an imaginary audience and narrates the incident and his response to it. Actually, the listener is implied. The reader of the poem feels that the speaker in the poem is speaking to himself. There are various examples of this genre. Fra Lippo Lippi in 1855, My Last Duchess in 1842, and A Grammarian Funeral in 1855 are some of the well-known poems of Robert Browning. The significant poets of the later Victorian period are known as pre-Raphaelite poets. These poets, namely Daisy Rossetti, Christiana Rossetti, William Morris, and A. C. Swinburne, are famous for their pictorial poems. These poets were actually painters. They were the artists of the period. They revived the form of the painting before Raphael. They carried the pictorial quality in their poetry. Daisy Rossetti's well-known poem, The Blessed Damsel, in 1850, is a beautiful painting in words. The famous poem for its pictorial quality is Christiana Rossetti, Goblin Market, in 1862. One of the noteworthy poets from the later Victorian period is Matthew Arnold. He described literature as criticism of. He was very serious about the role of poetry in the shaping of the good society. His poems, such as The Scholar Gypsy in 1853 and Dover Beach in 1867, illustrate the high ideals of the human. From this point, we'll move to the modern period. The modern period in English poetry begins with the 1914 with the commencement of the First World War. The war years produced war poetry and carried two contradictory responses to the war. Rudyard Kipling glorified the war and the war soldiers and rebuked those who remained idle during the war. While the poet, who also happened to be the soldiers on the battlefield like Hedbane, Siegfried Sassoon, Rupert Bruce, and the Wilfred Owen, expressed the horrors of the war and criticized the authorities for sending the innocent people to war. Apart from war poetry, the important poets of the modern period are W. A. Yeats and T. S. Eliot. William Butler Yeats was an Irish poet known for the poetry of deep mysticism. His poems are symbolical and mythological. The Second Coming, Sailings to Byzantium, and The Tower are some of his best known poems. T.S. Eliot also is one of the most celebrated poets of the English poetry. He modernized English poetry both in content and form. His poems brings out the elements of modernity in the 20th century. The effect of the horrors of the First World War, the advancement of science, the loss of the faith in religion, science and humanity, and frustration resulting out of it are well expressed in the poetry of Eliot. Is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in 1915 depicts the dilemma of the modern man who remains active on the level of the thought only and lacks any action. Eliot's notable poem includes The Hippopotamus in 1920, The Westland in 1922, Journey of the Maggie in 1927, and The Four Quartet in 1941. Eliot is known to the world for his modern epic, The Westland. The Westland offers a bitter criticism of the spiritual barrenness of the West. The poem is highly complex because of the various allusions which are used. Other notable poets of the modern times are Dylan Thomas, Philip Larkin, Carlos Williams, Seamus Heaney, and so on. Dylan Thomas and especially Philip Larkin are known for the use of the animal imagery in the poem. The central subject of the poetry of the Seamus Heaney is nature with its various aspects. So, dear friends, I hope you understand this section. Have a good day.